North American Indians in the History File.
Powwow, an ancient Indian tradition which still survives in 20th century America. The Indian is one of the strongest symbols of American culture. From films about the Wild West to tourist attractions like this one, people are fascinated by the colourful history of the Indians. But how much do these modern Americans really know about the true history of their country's oldest inhabitants?
Let me get one more. Oh, you guys are cute.
American Indians are descended from hunters who came originally from Asia. 10,000 years ago, when Asia and America were still joined by a narrow strip of land, the hunters crossed over to America in search of food. Over many generations, they spread out to cover the entire continent. By the time of Columbus, they had developed into a mass of different tribes. What all Indian societies seem to have had in common was a deeply religious attitude to their world. Although they had many different beliefs, most Indians felt they were spiritually connected to the land and to everything in it. Their most important belief was that you could never own the land. It was not a possession which could be carved up and divided amongst individuals or families. Columbus reached the New World in 1492 and thought he had discovered a wild country full of primitive people. For Europeans, this event would lead to unimaginable wealth and power. For Indians, it was the start of the invasion of their land and the destruction of their world. By the early 1600s, little more than a century after Columbus's voyage, many Europeans had arrived on the east coast of America. The permanent English colony in Virginia was quickly followed by a French settlement in Nova Scotia and a Dutch trading post near to modern-day New York. When the Pilgrim Fathers arrived in Massachusetts in 1620, the English gained a second foothold in the New World. The Pilgrim Fathers were Puritans who believed that they were doing God's will in coming to America and creating a population of white Christians. Their view of the world was based entirely on the Bible, and they believed that it was their manifest destiny to tame this new continent. Europeans believed that they had come to a wilderness. They could not see that many native people had a highly successful way of life, based on careful use of the environment. The Indians roamed the countryside, hunting, harvesting wild foods, and sometimes growing crops. But because the Europeans couldn't see the kind of farms they were used to, they thought the Indians weren't using the land properly. The settlers also noted that it was often the Indian women who tended the crops. They began to think of the Indians as a lazy people who were occupying more land than they needed or knew how to use. To begin with, the Indians and Europeans seemed to get on well. Indians helped white settlers through their first hard winters, and white traders introduced Indians to new goods and technologies. In exchange for furs, particularly beaver, the Indians received metal tools, pots, beads and woolen cloth. Indians often had their own reasons for wanting to acquire European goods. They needed beads, for example, for their own ceremonies. Guns helped them kill more animals to trade with, and everyday metal objects could be turned into ornaments. But trade goods were not the only thing the settlers had brought with them from Europe. Deadly infections such as smallpox, cholera and bubonic plague began to sweep through the Indian population, infecting many who had never set eyes on a white person.
As they lie on their hard mats, the pox breaking and mattering and running one into another, their skin clearing by reason thereof to the mats they lie on. When they turn them, a whole side will flay off at once, as it were, and they will be all of a gore blood, most fearful to behold. And then, being very sore, what with cold and other distempers, they die like rotten sheep.
Whole Indian villages were wiped out. So many died that there was no one to bury the corpses. The Puritans saw this epidemic as a sign that they were doing God's will.
In sweeping away great multitudes of the natives, God hath hereby cleared our title to this place.
The woods are almost cleared to these pernicious creatures to make room for a better growth.
The Puritans set about creating this better growth in a way which was to change the American landscape forever. They brought with them European farming methods and animals, and changed the New England of hunting and harvesting into one of organized farmland and fences. The Puritans were particularly keen on fences because they showed everybody that they owned the land. As the Puritans took over more and more land, the Indians began to resist. In May 1637, hostilities between the two groups finally came to a head. A group of Puritans mounted an expedition against the Pequots, a powerful Indian alliance. Convinced that God was on their side, the Puritans set out to do battle. To begin with, they were supported by Indian warriors from rival tribes. But these Indians soon withdrew when they realized that the English intended not just to defeat the Pequots, but to exterminate them.
Thy blessings on thy people be
Many were burnt in the fort, both men, women and children. Others forced out and came in troops to the Indians, 20 and 30 at a time, which our soldiers received and entertained with the point of the sword.
God is over us! He laughs his enemies to scorn and makes them as a fiery oven.
Down fell men, women and children. It is reported that there were 400 souls in this fort, and not above 5 of them escaped out of our hands.
The Pequot massacre set a pattern that was to be repeated over and over again as the invaders spread further and further into the continent. In 1763, the British, who now ruled this part of America, established a frontier along the Appalachian Mountains. The settlers were not allowed to advance beyond this line. All the land to the west of it was left in the hands of the Indians. But it wasn't long before the new leaders of the United States took over from the British. they opened up the frontier again and let the settlers through. A law was also passed that Indian land could only be bought by the government. Over the next 90 years, Indians were forced to make treaties which gave the whites control over huge areas of their land. The treaties showed up the differences between the Indian and white attitudes towards the land. Many Indian leaders tried to express their feelings to American officials, but as their speeches had to be translated and written down by whites, it's hard to know how accurate our record of them is. But they do give an insight into the way Indians felt at the time.
The earth was created by the assistance of sun, and it should be left as it was. The country was made without lines of demarcation, and it is no man's business to divide it. I see the whites all over the country gaining wealth, and see the desire to give us lands which are worthless. The earth and myself are of one mind. Perhaps you think the Creator sent you here to dispose of us as you see fit. If I thought you were sent by the Creator, I might be induced to think you had a right to dispose of me. I never said the land was mine to do with it as I chose. The one who has the right to dispose of it is the one who has created it. I claim a right to live on my land and accord you the privilege to live on yours.
As the frontier was pushed further and further west, the American government forced the Indians to move huge distances from where they had always lived to what the government called Indian Territory. In the winter of 1838, over 4,000 Cherokees died on what became known as the Trail of Tears. By the 1860s, the only large part of America still held by the Indians was the Great Plains. Here, tribes such as the Sioux, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho had begun to use horses and guns. They had developed a way of life based on the hunting of buffalo. The wagon trains crossing the area on the way to California disrupted the vast herds of buffalo and made it more and more difficult for the Indians to hunt. Driven close to starvation, the Plains tribes started to fight back. For almost the first time, the United States found itself in a prolonged war with the Indians. From now on, the white population of America would always remember the Indian as the bloodthirsty savage. The Indians would mutilate their victims because, according to Indian beliefs, the whites would then be reborn disabled in their next life. As stories of Indians killing whites spread, the whites lost patience. It was easy to forget that whites had been massacring Indians for generations. The battle for the Plains cost the United States millions of dollars and led to America's only defeat in a war against the Indians, when the Oglala Sioux leader, Red Cloud, forced the government to sign a peace treaty. The army had failed to defeat the Plains tribes, and so the US government tried something else, something less expensive. The government told white hunters to go out and destroy the Indians' main food supply, the buffalo. Rotting buffalo carcasses littered the plains. They were stacked at railheads to be shipped to factories to make fertilizer and explosives. In the mid-1800s, there were about 60 million buffalo in the United States. By 1910, there were thought to be just 85 left. In killing the buffalo, the whites had destroyed the Indians' whole way of life. The Black Hills were the most sacred area within the Great Sioux Reservation. But when gold was discovered there in the 1870s, prospectors poured in. The government was frightened that there would be war between the Sioux and the prospectors, and so they sent the army in to round the Sioux up. But the Indians fought back, and the expedition ended with the annihilation of General Custer and his men at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The government poured reinforcements into the plains. The Sioux and Cheyenne were heavily outnumbered and desperately short of food, and gradually the army brought them into reservation compounds, where they were imprisoned. The Plains tribes, the last hope for America's native people, had finally been defeated.
The white man made us many promises, more than I can remember. But they never kept but one. They promised to take our land, and they took it.
Less than 400 years after the arrival of Columbus, the Indians had lost almost the whole of North America. The relentless spread of the Europeans had left them with less than 7% of their land. And through disease, warfare, starvation, and despair, the Indians themselves had been driven close to extinction. In 1888, a Nevada Paiute called Wovoka had a vision. God told him that by dancing and performing certain rituals, Indians could bring back their old way of life. Wovoka and his followers believed that their dancing would make the ground roll up like a carpet, taking the whites with it, and that the dead Indians and their animals would return. In a last frenzied effort to preserve their way of life, tribespeople throughout the West danced and sang for supernatural help. The help they danced and sang for never came. In December 1890, soldiers opened fire on a group of unarmed Sioux at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. More than 300 men, women, and children were killed.
I can still see the butchered women and children lying heaped and scattered all along the crooked gulch, as plain as when I saw them with eyes still young. And I can see that something else died there in the bloody mud and was buried in the blizzard. A people's dream died there. It was a beautiful dream. The nation's hoop is broken and scattered. There is no center any longer, and the sacred tree is dead.
Before the arrival of Columbus, there were more than 5 million Indians in America. By 1890, there were only 250,000. During the same period, the white population increased from 0 to 75 million. For most white Americans, Indian history ended with the massacre at Wounded Knee. But the final chapter was yet to be written.
In Historyfile,